So let's get right into it, and let's begin with Ukraine. It's such a dominant story in the world. I think maybe the most important event in international politics since the end of the Cold War. I was just back from Europe, and it certainly felt that way there. But let's talk about China with respect to that, because it's a little more distant from China, and China's played a bit of a role. But how have they behaved? Have you been surprised by their behavior? What lessons do you think they're learning? What is the effect of the war in Ukraine on China itself, and then we can get to U.S.-China policy and so forth?
Well, I think the Chinese have sought to kind of walk a line between their support for Russia, which in the end is not going to change. They're not going to abandon Putin, despite the hopes of some people in the West when the war began that somehow we could peel the Chinese away and appeal to their better angels and persuade them that they should be on our side and opposed to this kind of aggression. That's not going to work. Russia is essential as an ally to China, and they're not going to let Russia or Putin go. At the same time, at least to this point, the CCP leadership has been careful about not appearing to do things that might justify further harsh measures from the United States or our allies, secondary sanctions if China was to overtly supply Russia with military equipment, for example. I should say, and maybe we can talk about this, there is now some discussion about whether that may be about to change. The U.S. has let it be known that we have some information that suggests that possibly the Chinese leaders are thinking about providing Russia with military equipment, which would be a major and, from our perspective, escalatory step that we're trying to deter, but it hasn't happened yet. But even short of that, the Chinese have found ways to help keep Russia afloat. They've increased their imports, particularly of energy from Russia, and they've also increased exports of a variety of goods, including so-called dual-use items like semiconductors that could be used in military equipment, maybe some so-called non-lethal kinds of assistance, navigation equipment, and so on. So they've walked a line. They've been careful. I guess the other thing to say.
And what are the considerations on each side for them? Because I guess on the one hand, you look at what was the Putin-Xi meeting, which was at the Olympics, just about a couple of weeks before the invasion, I guess. Yeah. And they had some phrase, I can't remember. They were all in together, right? What was that?
Right. Unlimited partnership.
Yeah.
Like that.
They haven't really quite behaved that way, I think, on the one hand. And you sort of think, and so I guess why not? Are they worried at the price they would pay here or in Europe or generally? And then on the flip side, I guess, is why not go all the way and curry favor with the West and just leave Putin alone? It's not their war, They don't like Putin presumably that much. So say a little bit about that. Yeah.
Well, on that side of it, I think some people argue, in fact, that Xi Jinping does have a kind of personal connection to Putin, whether it's because they're the two dictators, or because he has this sort of residual respect for Russia, for the Soviet period that Putin in some sense shares. So there may be an aspect of that, but of course, she is pretty cold-blooded. I don't think it's sentimental. But from a Chinese perspective, to have another authoritarian dictator defeated, if only indirectly, by the United States and its allies, and possibly even put in a position where his regime is overthrown. That's be the worst case scenario. That's a nightmare. The Chinese can't tolerate that. Also, just from a kind of geopolitical point of view, having Russia in the game is of great assistance to China in its long-term competition with the United States and the West. It provides it a sort of secure rear area, its inner frontier that they don't have to worry about. Secure supplies overland of energy, of grain, and so on. And also, Russia as a power keeps some portion of America's energies and attention, and of the West's energies and attention more broadly, focused away from Asia and away from the Pacific. And I think that, from Xi Jinping's perspective, is a positive thing. And he would like to keep that because he's afraid that if somehow that were to be removed, then the U.S. would be free to shift all of its energy and attention to him. And
that's very interesting.
He doesn't want.
Very helpful on that side of the equation. Much clearer than most of the explanations I've seen. What about the flip side of the equation? Why not do more? There's reports now that our intelligence thinks they may be ready to do more. I take it we're trying to deter them from doing more. Some people I know are surprised they haven't. They've done some sanctions busting, I suppose, and helping of Russia, but not everything. Do you agree? Not a lot of what they could have done. So why the relative restraint on that, on the flip side of the equation?
Yeah, the things that they haven't done yet would be to overtly supply large quantities of arms and ammunition. And the two things that people are talking about as possible shifts in their policy, although there's no evidence of this that I'm aware of yet, would be providing Russia with artillery ammunition and maybe weapons, because they're using these at a tremendous rate, and possibly also specifically military drones. Apparently they've sold some civilian drones to the Russians, but they've been careful. And I believe the reason is that they don't want to run afoul of the United States and of our European allies. They don't want to find themselves the targets of, as I mentioned, secondary sanctions that we might conceivably impose. We haven't done that, although we've targeted particular Chinese companies that we've accused of trafficking in some of this dual-use material with Russia. But they're worried about secondary sanctions. And I think one of the things, at least thus far, that they must have taken out of how the West has dealt with Russia is when sufficiently provoked, the United States and its allies are capable of imposing pretty serious sanctions on what we perceive to be an aggressive power, even at the risk of imposing some costs on ourselves. The Chinese are never completely convinced of that. I don't know if they're convinced that we're going to stick with it, but they wouldn't want to be subject to that if they could possibly avoid it. I guess the other thing to say there, and it's related, is I don't think the CCP leadership at this point has any hopes that it can somehow persuade the United States to change course dramatically in its dealings with them. In other words, they don't think that we're going to soften considerably in our dealings with them. They believe the current, the Biden administration has continued, and in certain senses, even gone further in some respects than the Trump administration did. There was no kind of reset of relations when a new administration came in. So I don't think they have much hope of that. But I do think they still entertain the thought that they may be able to split our alliances, and in particular, that they may be able to drive a wedge between us and our allies in Europe. Some rumblings of that on some trade and technology issues. The war and China's posture on the war, its refusal to outright condemn Putin and oppose him in active ways, has accelerated the solidification of a much tougher view in Europe of China. And the Europeans are now willing to at least contemplate doing things in dealing with China, which we'd hope that they would, but they've been reluctant to. And if they were to take this next step and really actively support Russia in the war, I think they would be concerned that any hope of weakening our alliance, dividing us from the Europeans, would evaporate. The one last,
just to say, I think on that, that's very important. I mean, I just back from Europe's meetings and some government officials who dealt with China directly, and members of legislatures and so forth. And they're very struck by that. I mean, China is sort of given up on the U.S. for the foreseeable future. I mean, they still would like to damp down certain things and confuse us in certain ways and prevent what they would regard as the worst outcome. But Europe is very much in the balance. I think they are a little surprised, perhaps, and I want to hear you about this and the general unity against Russia, against Putin on behalf of Ukraine. I think the Europeans, to their credit, are telling the Chinese that, look, we're sort of not where the Americans are on you, and we want to keep, our trade relations and so forth. But if you overtly help Putin in a big way, in a sort of war-changing way, very hard for us to sort of treat that as business as usual, which is they're so sort of for now still trying to maintain some of that with China. Is that your sense?
Yes, I don't think they want to, and this, of course, generalizing because Europe is many different actors. They all have national policies, but as a whole, they have tried not to be seen to be simply doing whatever the United States wants them to do. And that's, of course, for many reasons. But on China, as well as on other issues. They'd like to pursue a somewhat independent policy, certainly on economic issues. The French have talked a lot about this. The Germans at times have talked about it. So they don't want to be completely in the corner with the United States. At the same time, they're being pushed in that direction further and further by Russia's actions and by the recognition of their continuing dependence on the United States for backing up their security. And then also, as I said, by the revelation, which shouldn't have been a revelation, that the Chinese cast in their lot with the Russians and consider themselves to be joined at the hip with the Russians. And that's been, I guess, an unpleasant surprise for some, but it's accelerated, I think, a reconsideration of European policy towards China. In an interesting way, leaders in both Asia and in Europe, in democratic countries, have started in the last year or so to kind of talk in ways that are quite similar to the way in which many people in the United States talk about the world at the moment as being divided between authoritarians and democratic powers. And clearly, they see themselves on the side of the democracies. And increasingly, I think many see Russia and China as more similar than different, and certainly very different from the democracies. So they're inclined more to lump them together because of the character of their regimes. And the Chinese really don't like that. But I think it's the truth. I think it's something that many Americans have felt for some time. But increasingly, I think people in Europe take a similar view. This is a problem having to do with the nature of these regimes, and they're more similar than different.
No, that's really striking. I was struck when I was in Europe that they're less concerned about Taiwan, qua Taiwan, than we are, I think. But they are concerned about China writ large. They're not idiots. They know it's a massive thing in the next 10, 20, 30 years, excuse me, in international politics. And they don't quite have the dependency some of them had on Russia. Do you think also, I'm just curious, do the Chinese look at the degree to which some of the major European nations, and Germany in particular, have managed in 1 year to pretty much sever themselves from an energy dependence that was pretty large a year ago and a year and a half ago? They were going ahead with Nord Stream 2. I mean, that's an in my opinion, appreciated thing in the U.S., leaving about Europe. But leaving that aside, do they look at that and think, we have all these deep penetrations and ties, and obviously the large streak of European public and certainly political leadership wants to continue a kind of economic engagement, but they can do a little more there. They could pivot a little more quickly than we thought. Do you get the sense that the Chinese are thinking that? I
think so, although I believe their reading of the implications of that is probably mixed. I mean, on the one hand, what is one of the major lessons of the last year? It is that excessive dependence for critical materials, whether it's energy or rare earth minerals or some kind of manufactured products, excessive dependence on unreliable suppliers or suppliers who may, in the end, be hostile to you for strategic and ideological reasons is extremely risky. And A, and B, that you would be well advised to limit that dependence. And as you said, the Europeans have managed to do that much more quickly than I would have expected. This is something we've been nagging them about for years and telling them they shouldn't allow themselves to be so dependent on Russian energy. And now they've started to reduce that dependence. I think this experience has made people in Europe, and also I think in the United States, begin to focus even more on the nature of the dependence that we have on China for a variety of different kinds of manufactured goods, precursor chemicals, this kind of thing. It's been apparent for a while. I think our sensitivity to this, and the Europeans too, grew in part because of the COVID pandemic, realizing we couldn't make masks, and we relied on China for a lot of the precursor chemicals that go into drugs and this kind of thing. But we haven't done all that much yet to mitigate that dependence. And I think the experience of the Ukraine war is giving added impetus to efforts to reduce that dependence, whether it's by increasing domestic production or so-called friendshoring, relying more on friends and allies. the difficulty from our perspective, and maybe the saving grace from the Chinese perspective, is that the nature of our dependence on China is so much more complicated, and it's across a variety of different sectors. It's a huge volume of materials that we import. It's going to be very hard for us to reduce that dependence. Maybe in certain selective areas we'll do it because we're willing to pay the price, and that's part of the issue. You would have to pay more to source it from somewhere else. But I'm not sure they're convinced that we or our allies are really prepared, absent some huge catastrophe, to take further steps to reduce that dependence. I think we should. I think there's pressure to do that here. There's starting to be pressure in Europe. But if I was sitting in Beijing, I might say, well, they talk a good game, but look how much they depend on us for these products. Look how much they depend on our market for their own goods. We're not Russia. We're a much bigger player, and these countries are not going to be able to reduce their dependence on us. Of course, it remains to be seen, but it's mixed. I think the lessons are mixed.
Let's talk about our own policies, and I guess other Europe's as well, and our Asian allies as well. I mean, when we had our first conversation in 2019, I think you were a little heartened by some of what Trump had done, even though in a very somewhat ham-handed way, a little heartened by the fact that on these issues, Democrats are not even opposing Trump much, and some of the China stuff. When we talked a year ago, you were struck by how much the Biden administration had continued and revised, but let's just call them tough policies towards China generally, and there was bipartisan support. Just where do we stand today in terms of first the U.S. and then more broadly our democratic allies, sort of our own understanding and view of China, and then how intelligent if the policies are more hardline, are they intelligently more hardline, or sort of just randomly more hardline, and so forth?
Well, there's no doubt that the center of gravity, if you like, of discussion of U.S. policy towards China, at least in Washington, in political circles, has shifted markedly, for lack of a better term, in a hardline direction. And that's been very striking over the last 5 years, first. And secondly, the extent to which that shift appears to be bipartisan. You mentioned that Trump did various things that others hadn't done. There was not as much objection to some of these things as you might have expected, the trade and technology measures. The world didn't end the way people had said that it might if we imposed export control restrictions on Huawei and so on. And now the Biden administration has continued and even gone further in some of those policies. And that reflects, I think, this new emergent consensus. But what is that consensus exactly? What does it consist of? I think to the extent that there is agreement, it's on the fact that China is a challenge and even a threat, and across every conceivable domain: military, economic, technological, political warfare, and so on. You don't get much argument about that, at least from people in Washington. Maybe not so much from the China expert community. You would maybe talk about that, but one of the things that was striking, for example, about the response to the balloon episode was that the debate was, not really, should we shoot it down? Are we overreacting? And you had people saying that on the outside, but in Washington, it was just a question of when, should we have shot it down before it even took off from the ground, or, when it went over Alaska? There was uniform or nearly uniform feeling that this was a challenge we needed to respond, and that you find that across a range of areas. So greater recognition of the existence of a challenge or threat. There is not yet, I think, a workable consensus on exactly what the response or responses should be. And in that sense, I think your question suggested this, we are kind of popping off in a variety of different directions. And the administration is doing certain things, and Congress is proposing things right and left, all of which are intended in some way to hit back at China, or to counter things that it's doing that are perceived to be aggressive. But from where I sit, there is not yet a coherent and well understood and broadly agreed upon strategy for dealing with China. There's not really even a full agreement on exactly what the nature of the threat is. There is a threat. What's it all about? How severe is it? And what should be our policies to deal with it? So the range of discussion has grown narrower, but that doesn't mean that we've reached a point where everybody agrees on what the strategy should be. We're still in the early stages of this. And I know, people, you're not supposed to make these analogies to the Cold War, but it's inescapable. I think we're in the early stages, as we were maybe in the late 40s, early 50s, recognizing there's a threat, there's a problem, not yet fully converging on how to deal with it. So that's in the US. And there are divisions, maybe we can talk about some of those. There is a question, I think, about whether that consensus is going to be sustainable. There are people, I think, who want to take advantage politically of the China issue and would like to turn it into a partisan kind of cudgel to beat the other side over the head with. Right now, that seems to be more Republicans than Democrats. We're seeing a little bit of that already. So is that going to grow? And might this consensus break down? It's still kind of fragile. We're further along in that process than our allies, certainly in Europe, are. But I think they're also moving in the same direction.
And in Asia?
In Asia, I think they're further along. The Japanese, the Australians, Taiwanese are starting to come along. And there are some differences, Korea, but no, I think several of the countries there have been, in certain respects, out ahead of us in their appreciation of the severity of this challenge.
And which parts of the challenge do you think we have the better grasp on it or doing more on, or which are we sort of further behind on? I guess defense, economics, technology, technological dependence maybe is Taiwan. We probably shouldn't discuss Taiwan itself, right, which is kind of its own issue. But I mean, are you happier or think that we've made more progress in some areas and less in others, or is it kind of haphazard? Or
we certainly have made more progress in some areas than others. I think overall, what I would say about the current administration is, and over the last 2 years, in general, we're moving in the right direction. We're not going fast enough. And that's, the speed in which we're moving is different in different areas. So in the military domain, I do think there's much more widespread appreciation of the seriousness of the challenge to our position in the region and to our ability to support our friends and allies that's posed by China's continuing military buildup. And I think there's a recognition that we need to do more if we're going to maintain a stable balance, or a balance that deters aggression. From there, there's some disagreement about what exactly should be the priority. I think the biggest concern I have on that front is whether we are in fact going to increase defense spending, as I think we're inevitably going to have to do, and probably by a considerable amount, in order both to bolster our position in Europe and also strengthen our position in the Pacific. So we haven't gotten fully into that debate yet, but I think we're moving in that direction. So there's recognition of the threat and the need to do something about it, differences over how exactly to do it. And this issue of resources is sort of still in the background and our willingness to pay for it. On the economic front, I think there, on, let's say, the technology issue, there's much more concern than there was, certainly about issues of technology theft, forced technology transfer, and the need to deal with that. It took a long time to persuade people how serious that problem was. There was a lot of resistance on the part of business and others actually to acknowledging it and to doing something about it. There too, there's, I think, general recognition of the problem, although there's not full agreement on how serious it is or how to deal with it. The discussion on technology, though, I think has progressed pretty markedly in the last, say, 2 years. It's now no longer a sort of backward looking, what were they stealing from us and how should we punish them for what they did? It's more forward looking. And it's also not just about technology that's relevant for military purposes, but much more broadly, the extent to which China may now be forging ahead in emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, which will have relevance across all domains. So we're in the process of shifting our perception of China in the economic domain from a kind of normal trading partner, and we're still sort of half in that mode, to thinking of it as like a full spectrum competitor, a problem not just in the military domain, but in the economic and technological domains as well. And the Biden administration has taken large steps in that direction in the last 18 months. The export control restrictions on high-end semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment and so on. That really is not justified simply by a concern over the applicability of this technology or that to weapons. It's everything. And that's a big change. The other change in the way the administration has framed the problem, although they haven't been quite as explicit about this as I think they're going to have to be eventually, is to say we're not just concerned with preventing them from getting this or that. We need to slow them down. We need to maintain the greatest possible margin of advantage that we can in an array of technologies. That's a kind of a revolutionary idea. If you said that to people even a couple of years ago, and I can testify to this because having tried to say this to people, many of them just their heads exploded. What do you mean? We can't treat them as a competitor in this way. But that's really shifted. On the, I guess I would say on the overall trade relationship, we're not. I don't think we've figured out how to deal with that. It's so big and has so many elements that the idea of somehow cutting this cord and decoupling completely, I think is a non-starter. At the same time, there are a whole variety of problems that grow out of these different dependencies that we discussed, and dealing with them is going to require government intervention to change the way markets are functioning. And then there's this big problem of the political leverage that China has as a result of the importance of their economy to us and our allies. That continues to be a problem for us, I think, and we haven't figured out how to deal with it. It's the last issue, just to mention briefly, is what, for lack of a better term, I call the ideological issue or the regime issue. We've gone through a period when it was kind of impolite to talk about the character of the CCP regime, and they were in the process of changing. And then, well, even if they don't change, it doesn't really matter, to now accepting, I think, more broadly, that the character of the regime is the root cause of the problem that we have with China, as it is with Russia. But then what are the implications of that for policy? If you can't wave a wand and change the nature of their regime, how do you deal with that? And again, we're further along in acknowledging the existence of the problem. We have not yet, I think, converged on a way of dealing with it.
No, that's very helpful. A couple of follow-ups of questions on the economic side and trade side, technology side too. Corporate America, I feel like they've moved some from their, certainly 10 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, just kind of, oh, come on, we're all in on constructive engagement and basically turning a blind eye to everything that might point the other way, to more of a mixed sense. Are they lobbying hard against some of this stuff? Or are they just kind of stepping back and hoping it doesn't go too far in the direction they don't like? Or do they not care because some of the China investments and trade haven't worked out too well? I mean,
it certainly has changed. I think there was a more unified body of thought in favor of engagement, almost not at any cost, but because it wasn't perceived to have costs. It was all upside. And that's fragmented and broken down. And you have some industries and some companies which no longer see their prospects in China, and they are therefore less inclined to support or to oppose harder line positions on China. But it does vary. I mean, you have companies that still have large interests there and don't quite know what to do about them. Apple has this huge investment in China as a manufacturing platform for many of its products, I guess particularly iPhone, an acknowledgement that that's kind of a problem, partly because of the prospect of worsening relations with China, but also, I think, in the last couple of years, because of the sense that conditions in China are going to become less favorable to foreign businesses as the party state tightens its control. And so what do we do about that? The thing that I've noticed is there doesn't, people may be kind of lying low and keeping their heads down. You don't see prominent business leaders, for the most part, condemning the Biden administration for taking an excessively tough line on China. They may lobby behind the scenes for less stringent export control restrictions, or they may be opposed to the proposed regulation on outward bound foreign direct investment to China, and they lobby for that or for changes in those regulations. But at least for the moment, I think there's an awareness that the political winds have shifted, and people don't want to be seen to be taking a position that could be characterized as being somehow pro-China. But the economic relationship remains, it's very complicated. And some people are still making a lot of money and don't want to lose those possibilities.
Yeah, I'm struck by that. I mean, I'm struck by the uncertainty, I would say, in the business world compared to certainly 5 years ago, where there was much more certainty on the, come on, are you seriously suggesting we should reconsider some of this? I mean, this is the future, get with it. You don't hear that as much. Maybe they still think it, a lot of them. I don't know.
I think that's very, there's a big change there. The assumption that China was going to, just keep on growing at 7, 8, 9, 10, who knows, 10%, that's out the window. And now the question is, how rapidly are they going to slow down, and how low is the growth rate going to go? The notion that this is the great sort of El Dorado where everybody's going to make a lot of money, I don't think that that's now widely believed. Plus, you have this, this backdrop of political uncertainty. All of the arrangements that we had, the so-called globalization, as it grew up over the 30 years or so after the end of the Cold War, rested on certain political assumptions that kind of disappeared from, at least from our perception, not from the Chinese perception. That everybody's going to do what's sort of economically rational, and decisions are going to be made on the basis of judgments about cost and profit, and politics just doesn't enter into it. Politics has come kind of roaring back, both in the form of concerns about domestic developments inside China. And of course, a lot of this focuses on Xi Jinping and his increasing concentration of power in his own hands, but then also geopolitics, the recognition that relations between nations can break down for strategic reasons, and that will have enormously disruptive economic consequences. But the fact of those disruptions may not prevent the breakdown. I think people, at least in the West, in the United States, had kind of tuned out the politics and just sort of focused on the economics for 20 or 30 years. And that made a certain amount of sense for a while. It no longer does. And I think people are more aware of that. What to do about it, though, is